Hello, and welcome to another video. Today we will be delving into anything related to scaling, and with that we will have to answer what truly constitutes scaling. So let's try to answer that in this video. I'll be showing a few different iterations of a tier list for jungle, which will change the focus that we are currently using at that time. Are we looking at objective scaling? Are we looking at gold scaling, XP? Which part of the game do they scale into? How fast do they scale? Scaling with equal items, scaling with item differences, etc. And with all of that, we should get a general idea. So let's start off by laying out a plan for this video. The key takeaway should be how you can view drafting, win cons, and evaluating your own games. So we're hoping that at least somewhat you improve at least some of those things after watching this. For that, we want to define scaling. So figure out what affects it, how it should be interpreted in the context of the game, and what requirements it has. So let's get right into it, I suppose. So firstly, we'll look at the most basic tier list possible, where more or less this is around what people would consider scaling to look like in the jungle role. I am way too lazy to do it for every single role, and it would also look like a complete mess. So we only did it for jungle role. So I did something like this. I didn't put any champions in A tier because I think that these champions could be set to scale really well, and I don't really see the difference between like these champs. I could just move all of these champs like up one tier, and it's like same thing really. But I want A tier for later, so I just left it there. Either way, the tiers themselves don't actually really matter. The point is just these champions scale pretty well with gold, with items, with marks, with dragons, with whatever. These champions scale worse, right? But they scale somewhat in some way, and in some comps. These champions scale worse than those, and these champions are considered pretty bad at scaling, right? So this champion, this tier list, as you might have noticed, as with the language I've been using, it kind of explains itself. The tier list is really a tier list of how well champions utilize XP and gold. So if you give all of these champions on this tier list a lot of gold and XP, then these champions will end up usually performing the best. When Maokai was really broken, then Maokai would also be really high, because the issue was that he got to do a lot of stuff early, and then his E would do a lot from having gold, right? Though it's still a bit questionable. Obviously, some of these champs can utilize gold really well at certain points of the game, but most of these champs will end up utilizing the gold really well in mid-game, and then later on they will end up not using it so well, right? For example, I don't think that any of these champions can compete with a 6-item Evelynn, even though there are 6 items, or a Cortez, or an Echo, or I don't know, Kiana, or Kane, or Shyvana, or whatever else here. And obviously not Master Yi, because he's like probably the best item scaling champ in the game, I think. Just in terms of pure what he gets from items. So, okay, how can we refine this tier list into something that's a bit more usable? Because, okay, cool, if we have like a lot of items, we have 6 items, then these champions are gonna do the best, right? But, okay, right, well, I don't think that has a lot of value for us. That's just a general idea of scaling, which is something that most people have, even if they're bronze or something. So let's try to adjust this a little bit for reliability, consistency, carry potential, and so on. So look, if these champions get to be solo AP, then I think that they deserve to be here. Meanwhile, Master Yi has some issues with consistency, with how he needs his comps to be, his metas to be, and so on. Currently, I think he is strong enough for a pretty long while to actually deserve being really high, since people can take him to the top of Challenger. But in terms of the whole time that he's been in the game, let's just put him in like A tier, because he is not usually as good in high elo. So then Graves also, okay, pretty cool. He has an ADC and stuff, I guess technically, But would you really put him in the same tier as these champs? Probably not. Hecarim, let's say that Hecarim can stay here, whatever. Let's say that Kayn also stays here, but Shyvana suddenly is like, okay, well, you don't really have the same oomph as these champions for the same price, right? Then I think Talia also doesn't. Kindred, if she gets marks, she does, but without marks, I don't think that she does, right? And that's like another requirement and makes it even harder. I'm gonna move her down, and then Fiddlesticks also I'm gonna move down because same issue, right? Then Rengar I think is a bit unreliable and consistent oftentimes compared to these champions, right? I think Kiana is just not that good in jungle in the recent times. So this is more so when she was decent, but even if we include that, I don't think that she's as reliable as these champions. That's simply Graga's same issue. Viego, like, I don't know. I guess we can leave him there, whatever. And Udyr and Kha'Zix will be like moved down. And okay, let's say that we have something like this. It doesn't really matter what the tier list is in the end. Let's just say that it's a general idea, right? And it starts to make a little bit more sense. Because now it's like, okay, well, these champions are pretty consistently, especially these first three, are going to pretty consistently try to scale. And if they do scale, then they're pretty consistently going to carry the game, right? And have a really high impact on the game. Well, these champions are gonna do that a bit less, and these champions a bit less, and so on. Alright. So then, let's get into our second iteration of the tier list, where we will try to demonstrate how the role you play impacts your scaling within the confines of the game. And here we will demonstrate how some champions from other roles would slot into comparisons with jungle in a more general way. So this is useful though, because in this way we figure out if it's actually if it makes sense for us to scale as a jungler, right? Or as whatever other role we're playing. So let's say, for example, old Caston, right? Like, where would he slot into this? Like, he would probably slot literally right here at the top, right? He would either be the best or he would be like contending for the best. So, okay, it's pretty interesting. What about Kayle? I think she would also be there. Okay. What about the other good scaling champs, right? And I think that the other good scaling champs would also end up being like really high, or even outscaling like pretty much all of it, right? Though something like ADC would oftentimes come paired with a support, and if they're not paired with a support, I don't think that they would outscale it as often. But I think with a support, which is natural for them to have, they would end up outscaling anyway. And stuff like Ryze and whatever. So we do have a lot of champions in the game, or like Veigar or something like Syndra. Like, these champions could really easily outscale. So we do have a lot of champions in the game that are especially mid laners, ADCs. If you want some top lane examples, maybe like Fiora, Gangplank or something, that can actually outscale even our best scaling champs in jungle, right? And in a similar way, we have some champs that get outscaled by even our pretty mediocre scaling champs in the jungle role, right? Like, these champions are not the best at scaling, but I'm sure that we can find some champions that are completely horrible at scaling in other roles, right? So I'm trying to figure out if I can just find an example pretty easily, but I'm kind of struggling right now. I don't think this tier list has all the champs either. I mean, okay, we can say like Mordekaiser complete late game, like in top lane or something. Like, that thing could even have less impact than half of these champs have at some point. So that can also happen. Meanwhile, if we play something like ADC, for example, right, like the worst scaling ADC would still slot somewhere in the middle here, right? And the best scaling ADC would slot higher. While if we play something like, let's say support with the gold income, like with the same gold income, if we have like 20k gold or something, right? Then supports would end up being below here, while maybe the best scaling supports would be like somewhere near the top, but like the ones that don't scale so well would still end up being below here, right? So the role that we play affects what kind of scaling we do, and even if we have the same gold as the other roles, we will still end up in a different scaling bracket of sorts. So it kind of defines how we want to play every role in a way. Okay, so then we can adjust this tier list a little bit further for kind of practicality in terms of how does this stuff make sense, right? Like which champions actually make sense to play, because if they don't do anything, but they scale well, right? But they just do nothing, and then they get outscaled by some laners anyway, and they're bad into like a lot of comps and stuff, then suddenly those champs are usually going to end up being worse, right? And that would end up giving us something like a more general tier list that people usually make. That's like usually what they end up doing, right? Like, okay, so some iteration of that, like, okay, how did they scale? How did they do? Blah, blah, blah. And that ends up being it, right? So for example, Kiana, a lot of risk, but okay scaling, but then she would end up being like lower by a lot. But okay, let's leave this as a scaling tier list and not throw it around too much so that we can keep using it. So next, let's try to talk about the effects of comps on how scaling will end up working, right? So there are some comps where good scaling champs can scale badly, or bad scaling champs can scale well, right? So let's take a comp with Nidalee, right? Like it doesn't even matter what she has in her team, right? So we're just going to look at this, and then we're going to put something like, I don't know, let's say Caitlyn, the enemy team, and then we're going to put like Varus, I don't know, like we have like Caitlyn, Varus, and then let's put some like poke, whatever, mid laner. It's like fine, whatever. Then let's put like some AP jungler as like ranged, and let's put what do I want to put as the top laner? I don't know, let's put like Quinn or something. So obviously you can tell that the enemy comp is not good, right? So this is a pretty solo queue example. It's not gonna happen in comp, but we're not talking about comp anyway, because why would I talk in comp when I make content for mostly solo queue? So in an example like this, does Nidalee really seem like such a bad pick in terms of scaling? Okay, so if I get high AP on Nidalee, I scale up, I'm 6 items. Okay, I hit enemy with 1 spear, and what happens? Like 90% of their HP is gone. So my champion doesn't scale badly, right? In this scenario. In this scenario, my champion actually scales pretty well. Like, even if I go to late game, I will have impact. I will be good, right? Oh. Cringe. So then, what do I struggle into, right? Like, why is my scaling considered so bad? Okay, so firstly, if we have something like this, and then we add on like this and this and this, like suddenly my champ can't do anything when we scale. Like I cannot do a single thing, right? Because these champions just engage, they will chill and just go completely all in. Like I need the enemy champs to play slower. I need to be able to poke them, but this guy sustains. These guys are like full tank. They have way too much front line. They block my spears with Samira W. Like it's just disaster, right? Okay, that's one example. What's another example, right? Like maybe enemy goes full tank anyway, but okay, oh, this is horrible. So now we have like a top laner that gets like some MR and heals up. We have like a mid laner, it's like full front line, and we have like a jungler that's pretty tanky. And then we have like some ADC that's, I don't know, like this thing that doesn't let us engage. And then we have some healer support as well. Like, let's say Sona. Right? Like now, even if we do get some poke off on Zaya or something, or maybe Gragas, I don't know. Like we can't even poke these two. Now, suddenly Sona will heal them up anyway, even if we add some squishies into the mix, right? Like some champs that are fine for us. So let's say that we add like a mid laner that's like more fine. So let's say, I don't know, like Victor or something, I don't know. I mean, he scales really well, but whatever, man. And let's put a top laner that's like worse, right? Still, this comp is a lot worse to play than the other one. Mostly because now they still have some frontline and they have a healer, right? And because they have a healer, suddenly the Nidalee champion is much worse at scaling. So we kind of showed a few comps where Nidalee can actually scale well or scale really badly. So does this also apply to the top champions, right? Like, let's say Evelynn or ksante, right? Like, let's try to run through 2 quick examples of where those 2 champs would be horrible. So let's say we're playing Evelynn, right? And suddenly, this appears in the enemy team. Okay. This appears in the enemy team. Okay. This appears in the enemy team. Okay. This. Okay. And then, I don't know, like this or something. Or this. Like, suddenly we don't scale. Yeah, we scale. We still do the same damage if we get the same items. But first of all, getting those items is 10 times harder than it is than it was before when we played against easy comps to play against. And second of all, like, what do I do? Even if I have my items, like, who do I kill? This guy will just ult me. This guy will ult anyone I go on. This guy will revive anyone I go on. This guy's full tank. And this guy just ults if I go on him. So I have to go in a team fight, and I have to have my team do stuff. Now I'm relying on my team after forcing my team to play with a weak early game champion. So my team didn't have a jungler for the start of the game, right? So that makes the game really impractical for my team. I don't really scale into becoming a true win con like I would if the enemy comp was good for me, and yet I still need the same resources and stuff to function at a much lower level, which makes my scaling really bad in that game. And since my champion's purpose is scaling, in a way, that just makes my champion bad in that game also. And most of these champions have like the same kind of examples. So like ksante, we can say, okay, we have horrible matchup mid lane, like, I don't know, Tristana or something that's considered bad for people. People don't like this matchup. And then we're gonna take some really disgusting jungler that like perma-ganks us or whatever, I don't know. Like, let's say this thing, or I don't know, we can say something else as well, so that we're not... I mean, I don't think we use this champ yet, so whatever. And then, okay, now let's try to use some different champs as well. So, okay, then let's put this thing here, or, whatever, let's put Camille here. Okay, Camille. Now, already you can tell that, okay, enemy has a lot of AD. Okay, at least I can go Frozen Heart, right? So, not that big of an issue. I mean, it's not nice. I mean, I will get perma-ganked, perma-shoved, perma-poked, perma-unplayable. Tristana scales pretty well. And... okay. And even if I scale up to late game, Camille will still be an issue for me. Tristana will still be kind of an issue for me. But it's okay, right? Because they don't have more. They don't have, like, more issues, right? And then they just, like, keep layering on the issues. Like, I don't know. They say, like, yeah, it's okay. We're picking Vigor ADC. So we have some magic damage anyway. And hard scaling. Okay. Small issue, but okay. And then, I don't know. Let's just say that they pick some random support. Like, I don't really care what support they pick. Like, we can say old Yumi before she got, like, changed, because I don't know what the fuck she even does right now. We can say that they pick some engage support or something. I don't know. Doesn't really matter too much. Let's just say that they pick some engage support. Whatever, man. Like, this game is really unplayable. Even if I scale up, Nautilus, point and click ult. Vigor, point and click 2k damage. Camille, 10k true damage, ults me, I can't escape with my ult, I can't split push, okay. Perma ganks me, Perma makes my lane unplayable, so there's no way I'm scaling, right? So this should demonstrate in a way how some of these champions, despite having what's considered good scaling with gold and XP and stuff, it becomes pretty impractical due to how unversatile they are. So something like Kha'Zix can become better because it has more versatility, because it can go bruiser, it can go assassin, it can go whatever, right? It also doesn't rely on comps that much. It's also AD, and AD is technically better than AP in a way, because if you go more than one AP, it's kind of wasted, because one AP is just fine, because if the enemy doesn't go MR, you will one-shot those people, and if they do go MR, then you already got them to go MR, so what's the point in having another AP? Then you're just lowering both of your values, because the enemy has to go MR either way, so it's just nice to play solo AP in most scenarios, unless you play something like Zoe or something where you don't really need to be solo AP, because you won't really benefit from it that much, and you one-shot despite not being solo AP, so something like double AP can be optimal for her. But that's another topic. So then we can see that these champions are going to become very different in terms of where they land, depending on how the game changes, right? Like in some of those drafts, like when we had the complete tank melee draft, right? Like the anti-Nidalee draft, right? So they had like Gragas and Sejuani and all of that stuff. Like in that scenario, something like Mordekaiser could actually scale pretty decently, while Nidalee scales horribly. And then there's like another scenario where we had like the full ADC comp, right? Where Nidalee scales actually pretty well. But then some of these champs might scale pretty badly, right? Like, which champion would be like the worst of these? Probably something like let's say, I don't know, Kindred without Marks would be really unfun to play against them, because they are all ranged, so you don't get the benefit of playing as melees. Like Udyr could be pretty unfun if you're not actually ahead, because either you will completely run them down and they cannot do anything, or they will do so much damage that you can't play the game, really. So kind of a double-edged sword there. And there are quite a few things you consider in these scenarios, right? Like, am I AD? Am I AP? Are enemy like good against AP, AD? Are enemy like sustain? Can enemy engage really well? Is enemy melee? Is enemy ranged, right? Like a lot of stuff like that will end up changing up the dynamic of scaling within League. And that's why it's important to think about when picking your champion, and also picking how you want to play the current game. So next up, let's talk a little bit about items and game stats, which makes it so some champs won't end up scaling. Like, for example, a one item Evelynn will never scale into anything until 50 minutes, right? So how behind can you really be? Like, that's something that really changes stuff up. So Gaston was a really good example of a scaler for a long time, because Gaston didn't really need items. He needed level 16, right? So if he got level 16 and he was down an item or two, it was still fine. He was still really strong, right? If he was even on items, and he was Exodia. If he was even behind an item, he was still Exodia, right? So that's like insane in terms of this. But for example, Kayle, she also has a really good level 16, right? And she's considered really good at scaling. But what issue does she have? Well, if she doesn't have items, no one really cares about her that much. Like, okay, she has a cool ult, but at level 16, she gets permanent exalted and she gets some range. But if she has no items, then that doesn't really matter too much, right? Like, it's not such an issue for us. Champions like Evelynn also. And this really leads us into how we assess who's going to be a problem and who's going to scale within the game when we actually press tab. So these champions like also Veigar, for example, he will scale even if he doesn't have a lot of items. Victor will scale with mediocre items. Vladimir needs good items to scale, right? Like if Vladimir doesn't have good items, he won't scale even later on. But here it's a question of, do you scale with XP or do you scale with gold, right? That's like the big question here. And some champions are both, like Kayle or something. Gaston can also be both, but he prefers XP and he doesn't care that much about gold. Then Vladimir cares a lot about gold. He also cares about XP, obviously. Like, all of these scalers do care about both. But the question is, which one do they care more about? And how bad are they without both of them, right? So within the game, when you look at these champs, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, realistically, they should keep falling behind a bit as they're trying to scale, because they have to give stuff up to scale, right? So if they're one item down right now, then in 10 minutes, they will be up like an item, or well, down like an item and a half, but they will have like levels and whatever, and they will have like more items in terms of just raw number of items, and I will also have more items, so technically the relative gap kind of closes a little bit. So is that enough for them to actually scale? So that's something to consider. Lastly though, I want to compare scaling champs between each other and show how having slightly worse scaling can be better based on timings. So here I'm talking about power spikes, like mid game, late game, items, levels, and so on. So something like, let's say Evelynn Cortes, right? Like, I would say that Evelynn technically scales better into mid and late game, but I think that Cortes is already pretty strong early. So I actually like the matchup for Cortes. And then we have these matchups like Kasten, Vladimir or something, right? Like originally, I don't know, like a few seasons ago when Kasten was like more scaling champ, right? And stuff like that, this was considered like a really bad matchup for Vladimir. And why? What is the big reason? Like in late game, if they're both really late game, like they can both carry, right? And it's not like Vladimir is that much worse at carrying than Kasten to warrant being complete counterpick. But you know what the issue is? It's not even so much laning, because, okay, you can survive laning, whatever. I mean, when Kasten went electrocute and he was chunking you in lane, it wasn't nice, but okay. But the problem is that Kasten was spiking on level 11 already. So his level 6 ult was already okay, but his level 11 ult was really good, and his level 16 ult was cocaine. So since he was spiking in mid game already, especially with these more damagey electrocute type of builds, then how does a Vladimir compare? Like, he was scaling the whole early game, and now Kasten is running around the map doing stuff all the time. And then in late game, Kasten should be ahead of him. So even if he did scale better into the complete late game, Kasten and his team are more ahead. So that's an issue, right? And even early game wasn't too nice to play. So then you also have these, let me find some examples maybe. Like these champions like, okay, Vel'Koz is a champion that spikes really hard in mid game, and then in late game he's like pretty decent, I guess. Okay, fine. And then you have, say something, let's say like Veigar or something. Like, I think that I don't really know this matchup because not many people play Vel'Koz, but let's just try to interpret it, right? So Vel'Koz has more range, and he will spike in mid game and spike way harder than Veigar. So I think that what can happen is that Vel'Koz gets there, and then they're both like pretty strong, but the problem is that Veigar doesn't have much counterplay against Vel'Koz, and then he just takes over for a while, and then Vel'Koz will get to 6 items when Veigar is on 4, let's say, right? And that means that he matched his scaling in the end, because on 6 items, Vel'Koz will be as strong or stronger than Veigar with 4 items, right? So these things are some things to consider. Even though the game might be like 30 minutes or something, you know, like you would think, late game, right? But that's not really how we want to look at it. So I did ramble on a little bit, despite having some points that I wanted to talk about, but I hope that you found some value in it. And if you liked the video, then like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, then write those in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Peace.